Hi there, I'm Judy Holland, and welcome to Happy Nest, the podcast where you can hear the latest research and best advice for living well when your kids leave home. Join me as I interview experts and explore how to reinvent yourself during this critical passage. I hope you'll head over to judyhollandauthor.com and check out my new book, Happy Nest, Finding Fulfillment When Your Kids Leave Home. Mario Luis Small is a sociology professor at Harvard University. He's also an expert on personal networks. In his book, Someone to Talk To, How Networks Matter in Practice, Mario reveals how people who need to vent or find a sympathetic ear tend to make surprising choices. Instead of telling their deepest secrets to a close friend or family, they often turn to acquaintances or relative strangers. In this podcast, Mario explains why people often share secrets or fears with a stranger sitting next to them on an airplane. He did a study that showed more than half the time people confide in others they don't really know. He found that people often avoid venting to those they're close to. Maybe they don't want to tell mom they're broke because she's broke too and might try to give them money. Or perhaps they have cancer and are looking for someone who shares a similar diagnosis. When I was writing my book, Happy Nest, I told Mario that it was stressing me out, which he easily identified with because Mario also faces book deadlines. At a time when people are reporting feeling more alienated than ever before, interactions with a relative stranger on your everyday travels may be exactly what we need to combat loneliness. Surprisingly, people often confide highly personal matters to people they barely know. Mario, what's up with that? That seems really weird to me.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. It's probably the single most surprising thing we found when doing this book. So everybody pretty much assumes that they don't trust people very much, that they're reserved, that they're rational, that they're thoughtful, that when they have personal problems, personal issues, personal pains, personal difficulties, that they're going to only talk about those issues to the people they're very close to. It turns out, if you ask people in theory what it is that they do, they will tell you that. They will tell you, I don't really trust just anybody with my big issues. They'll tell you, I wouldn't just confide this to anybody, this major issue that I'm facing right now. But if you actually follow their actions, if you reconstruct what they've done, what you'll see is that people will actually confess to having confided very personal things to anybody from the hairdresser to the bartender to the Uber driver to the stranger on the plane, but also more ordinary people like the guy they saw at the gym, the person they saw at yoga, the person they saw at church, to really just about not quite anybody, but close to that.
Okay, Mario, why? Why don't I tell my mother if I'm really worried and I'm young and I'm dating somebody that's mean, or I flunked a test, or I have some kind of a problem like that? Why don't I tell my mother? Why don't I tell my favorite cousin?
That's actually a really good question. In fact, part of the reason people end up confiding in people they don't know that well is they're avoiding their very close friends. One of the interesting things we did in the study is we interviewed people, and we first asked them who were the people they really trusted in their lives. And a lot of people said their mothers, actually, spouses, best friends, you name it. And then we just walked them through all of the big issues they were facing. And I remember one very common scenario for some of the younger people we were interviewing. These are young adults, men and women in their late 20s, early 30s, who often said, my mother's my best friend, I tell her everything. But then when talking about the issues they were facing, for example, I'm having a problem with my boyfriend or my fiancé, they would say, oh, I'd never tell my mother that. And it turns out that that was actually quite common. And the way we think about it is the fact that the people we're close to usually perform more than one role in our lives. So when I think about my wife, Tara, so my wife is obviously my intimate. We have a child now, so she's my partner as a parent. She's kind of my financial advisor. We make financial decisions together.
She's maybe better than you at that. Is she better than you at that? Nobody in my house is good at that at all. I'm sorry. I digress. Go ahead.
She's actually sometimes plays the role of a critic. My wife, like you, is a journalist, and I often give her my work to read and to tell me what I'm doing wrong. And of course,
that's rough.
Well, it can be. But also, she's a supporter. Now, what's good about this relationship is that my wife knows which role to enact in which situation. So if I give her a book I'm writing, I want the critic. I don't want the supporter, in the sense that I don't want her to give me a hug. I want her to tell me what's wrong with it. But if I'm having a really hard time with something on the day, I don't really want to hear the critic. I want the supporter. I want the embrace. And that usually works. Well, going back to the question as why anybody would avoid their own mother on something so important like a fiancé, a lot of what we found is essentially the fear of incompatible expectations. People thought, yes, my mother's great, but when I want to talk to her about, say, my fiancé, I just want to vent. I just want the listener. But she's going to get into protector mode, and I just don't want to hear the protector. And that was very, very common. Some version of that. They essentially don't want to enact the wrong role from the person they're close to. And because the people we're close to play so many different roles in our lives, it's actually much more common for that particular kind of issue to manifest itself with the people we're close to than the people we're not close to.
Okay. So, but Mario, why your book, Somebody to Talk to, why do people need to confide in others? What kind of mental health balance purpose does that provide? Why do people spill their guts to other people? What's the value of that, and in what circumstances do they do that? And then we're going to link into empty nesters.
So this is very interesting. It turns out that the idea that venting is good for you has been proposed by philosophers. So Immanuel Kant and Adam Smith, by the way, back in the 18th century, both said a version of this, that venting, confiding our deepest issues to others is actually cathartic to us, makes us feel better. But it turns out that these ideas that have been going about for a long time, confess your sins. If you think about what the confessional is in the Catholic Church, it's a version of the same thing. It turns out that these ideas that have been going around for a long time, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, have been increasingly supported by not just social science, but also medical science. Meaning there's an increasing number of studies showing that just venting, just talking about issues that are disturbing us, provides mental health benefits, improves our overall well-being. There are even studies suggesting, and these are randomized controlled trials, suggesting benefits for things like symptomology with rheumatoid arthritis and even cancer. There's a famous study where women experiencing breast cancer, and all of the people in the study would eventually die from it. So there's a long-term study. They would all eventually die. But what the intervention is that some of them were brought to a room, I believe it was once per month, and all they did was talk to other women who were also experiencing breast cancer and do a 5-minute mindful meditation exercise. So they did this, I think it was once a month for about a year or so. So it was a regular intervention, and that was it. There was no other difference between the control group and the experimental group. As I said, all of them eventually died. The women in the experimental group lived almost twice as many months as the women in the control group. There are other studies of this kind. That's, to me, one of the most dramatic ones, but there are others. And of course, no study is perfect, and you don't make big conclusions on the basis of one study. I just should make that clear.
But maybe if you think somebody else is in your shoes, then it takes to just kind of cliche you to death, it takes some of the weight off your chest, right? If you think somebody else is in your shoes and you are on the same page, you feel better.
Absolutely.
You're not alone.
I think so.
You're not isolated. Isolation, we know, is bad.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's both things. It's both the idea that people naturally understand the benefits of talking, even if they don't articulate them to themselves. But second, the ability to share something deeply troubling with somebody who can actually claim to understand. And that's the key. Somebody who can cognitively empathize with what you're experiencing. Empathy is not just sympathy. Sympathy is somebody is nice to you and is understanding. In the use of that term, that means they're essentially kind and sympathetic about it. What I mean is empathetic, which means They actually understand what you're talking about from your perspective. They've been through it themselves. They're going through it themselves, etc. The feeling that many people get from confiding in somebody who truly understands one's predicament is quite powerful. And conversely, the isolation that one can feel from having nobody who really understands our predicament, nobody who really understands. Think about people who are experiencing, who've been diagnosed with HIV, who are the only ones in their community, or who are of a particular sexual orientation and they're the only one in their community, or who just got fired or laid off.
Only one.
And the only one.
Everybody else is killing
everybody's exactly. It's not just that it feels bad, which of course it does, but it's also the inability of finding somebody who gets it can be pretty isolating. And conversely, finally getting to that person can feel amazing.
So what you're talking about is what I read about in your book, and you refer to as cognitive empathy, right?
Absolutely.
So we are, as humans, whether we know this name or not, we are looking for cognitive empathy when we're a little off or distressed or worried, and that might be for any number of reasons.
I believe so. I had a very powerful interview once where it was a radio interview, and I'm not going to get the details right, but the big idea is somebody called in, and this was a middle-aged man whose wife had started getting early onset Alzheimer's. Now, what's difficult about this is that they had adult children, and the adult children, it was too hard for them. They just didn't want to talk about it. And the husband was having a really difficult time. First, you couldn't talk to your kids, who were the only other people who were kind of going through it. But second, really, who's going to understand what it feels like to have your best friend of 30, 40 years suddenly not recognize who you are?
Somebody who's been through it.
Bingo. So this man who's not a softie, he's not the way he described himself, he's not the kind of person who would join support groups. He actually started one. He started just trying to find other people whose spouses were going through this experience just to vent, just to have other people to talk to who can understand, who can cognitively empathize with what they're experiencing.
Interesting, which brings me back to my subject at hand, which is empty nesters. Should empty nesters seek out others whose children have just left in order to find cognitive empathy?
Absolutely.
And let me tell you, just as an empty nester, so I have 3 children, and my youngest went to college 2 years ago. It is really kind of it's an existential jolt. It's a reminder that you're getting older, that your time is running out, because it's a major milestone. It's a change. And men and women in different, not necessarily down gender lines, but people, they look at it differently, or they respond differently, or they cover it up, but it really is a jolt. So when people are new empty nesters, what do you think, based on all your research about cognitive empathy and all this, what kind of advice would you give for empty nesters regarding personal networks and cultivating those and finding like-minded people and soul in the whole situation?
So the first thing I would say is that makes perfect sense. Being an empty nester is something that is quite hard to understand unless you're going through it.
How old is your child?
My child is an infant.
Right.
She's 14 months.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, and she's my first, and there are many things about being a parent that I never understood until now. I just didn't get it. And I can imagine it being very similar for an empty nester. I can imagine people saying, so what's the big deal? You now have the house to yourself. So you sell the house and you get something smaller. Or finally you're free. Or you were complaining about being busy all the time. Why are you whining now? You finally have all the extra time. Or, I can imagine a whole battery of things that people who haven't experienced it could imagine about somebody deigning to complain that the big problem in their life right now is that their children are finally out of the house. And so the first thing I would say is, it makes perfect sense to me that there wouldn't be a lot of people who would be empathetic. Not just sympathetic, but empathetic about this experience. So having said that, I would say absolutely, this is one of those situations where seeking out other people who have been through it is essential. And I don't just mean, find, of course, if whatever your religious faith is, there's a religious leader or a therapist or something like that who can help you walk through it, that's wonderful as well. But frankly, I think this is one of those scenarios where finding the people who are going through it is absolutely essential. So I would say, for sure, find them. And the question is, of course, how do you find those people? How do you fight the isolation that can come from not being around people who are like you? I think there's a couple of things. I think one of the things people tend to wrongly do is to think of networking as something that if you have the right skills, you can do, and if you don't, you don't. And networking almost as a verb, as the kind of thing that if you're good at handing out business cards and being proactive or something, there's all sorts of terms in business schools about this.
But we connect it to business. I hear networking and I think business. I'm a journalist. I don't do business.
Exactly.
I'm a word lady. But networking is more than that, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say networks are more than that. And I would say the way to embrace your networks, the way to expand your networks, is by doing the things you love to do. Doing the social things that you love to do.
For example?
You like golf? Go play golf. I assure you that in the golf, is it the clubhouse? There's going to be lots of other golfers. And some of who, first of all, are going to share with you the fact that they love golf. So they're going to be like you. And we all know that similarity is one of the most important way people find friends. But secondly, just probabilistically, you're almost certainly not going to be the only one who's a recent empty nester, who's an empty nester. You're going to be very likely to find people who are like you in other ways when you pursue the things that you like. If you like cooking.
It's the birds of a feather flock together, even though I just would never write a cliche, I'm spitting them out. But there's a reason a cliche is a cliche like that, right?
Absolutely.
So I do a lot of photography, and I actually photograph during lacrosse season for Yale University, and I have created all kinds of friendships from every different age, every educational background, all different people that are photographers on the side. I've got this really cool relationship going because I like images and I like to stop time because I feel like it goes too fast and I think I'm stopping it. So that's a place where I find something like this. And when all my 3 children were home, I didn't have time for these extra things. I could do my job and my kids and I couldn't do anything else. So that type of thing, going after, you're saying a passion, and then the people will self-select. If you're a bicyclist and you love fitness and going by things quickly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So here's the way to think about it. So for sure, there's the general idea of how to expand your network. We're going to call it that, which is a particular issue that the empty nesters are going to have because the kids are out of the house. And for many people, for many of their children's lives, their children were the path to their own expanded friendships. So
the soccer field,
absolutely,
the cross-country field,
absolutely.
And those people fall away, and I'm here to tell you they do. Most of them fall away.
Exactly. It's very common. In fact, the book I wrote before this was called Unanticipated Gains, and it was expressly about how mothers who had enrolled their children in childcare centers expanded their networks as a result, because you put your kid in the center, and through a whole bunch of mechanisms, you end up encountering other people who have children about the same age, because they're also in the center, and who therefore share a whole bunch of other things with you. Income levels, for example, neighborhoods, because of the way people end up in a childcare center, they charge what they charge. Either you can afford it or you don't. Like, people sort themselves in that way. They have children the same age, which means they probably had them around the same age, which means they're facing the same kinds of issues. Whether it was finally turning 40 or whatever it was, the work-life balance. There's a version of this at multiple stages in the life course. And so going back to the issue of empty nesters, the first issue that happens is kids are gone. So a primary mechanism, like you said, the soccer games and the activities and the school did this and the volunteering for the fundraiser and all that stuff is gone. And so a primary means of making friendship disappears. And so finding an alternative makes a lot of sense. And so pursuing what you love will put you in contact with other people who are like you in things that you love, which is a very natural way of expanding your networks. But then I would say, secondly, there's a particular issue of finding people who can understand the specific experience.
Cognitive empathy.
Bingo.
I'm learning, Mario. Yeah.
And I think exploring your networks in that way will often lead to that. If I think about my interests, my personal interests have evolved as I've aged. So, for example, when I was younger, I used to love playing basketball, and I had a lot of friends who loved playing basketball. But eventually, I tore my ACL and I have arthritis in my knee. And so now I no longer play basketball. I do a lot more yoga, and I do other forms of exercise. I dance. And so now, I encounter people who are less likely to play basketball, but who themselves, because of the life stage they're in, are actually much closer to my age and much closer to my interest. The natural course of the life course and the things that we tend to explore at different stages put us in a position of being around people who are like us. So pursuing your interests will increase the probability that you'll run into people who are also empty nesters, simply because of the way life courses and activities and interests proceed. I don't know much about you, but I would guess that one of your current interests is not playing football or
I do a ballet bar 3 every morning at 6:30, mainly with women half my age.
There we go.
And I hold myself to the same standard, and I'm friends with them when they invite me places and they seek my advice because they're trying to handle work-life balance. And some of them are, they teach ballet bar at 6:30 and then they're an economist and they go to work. Right. And then they get home to 2 little kids and they say, oh my gosh, Judy, you're still alive. Your kids are 25, 25, 23 and 20. And look, Judy's still here. And so right. I get invited to things because of this. And it is so much fun. And especially in the course of writing this book, you and I spoke about the isolation and the difficulty and the stress of writing a book.
Yes.
And how you seek, when you and I had the first conversation, I found some cognitive empathy in you because you've written books and you could understand where I was writing through a book. Whereas my husband, who's a surgeon, has no idea what I'm doing. And he thinks nobody's bleeding on the table, Judy. What's wrong with
big deal?
What's up with that? Chill. Let's go to a movie. Right?
Exactly.
His deadline is finished when the person's rolled out of the operating room.
Whereas a book has to stay in your head until it's done.
It won't go away.
It won't go
away. A story goes away. An article goes away. I used to cover Hillary Clinton. That would go away. At the end of the day, I file it. It's on the wire. I can see the New York Times wires have it. I'm out. This doesn't go away. It haunts you. It's just a specter.
Absolutely. And it's hard to understand unless you're going through it.
So there's another thing that you mentioned in your book and when we spoke about strangers in your travels. And you got me really thinking about this. Strangers kind of along the way. So in my daily travels, let's say I take a train to see you here. There might be somebody sitting next to me in the train and I get talking to the person in the train. I went to the gym. I used to go to the gym a lot and ride a stationary bicycle and a woman at the gym divulged to me that she'd had cancer and she hadn't told anybody close to her. And I wasn't sure at that point I knew her last name.
Exactly.
So strangers, when you keep yourself open to, and I'm thinking hard about this, people along the way, that means you go buy a donut and you might stop, take a breath and engage with the person that sells you that donut. And then you realize you learned something about them. I think I have lots of really short, little, bright interactions throughout my day, partly because I'm a 10 out of 10 on the extrovert scale, but just because I'm a reporter, I engage people. Talk about that, Mario. Yeah. I really feel like in just about anybody's life, way beyond empty nesters, but that is a good way to kind of open yourself. You would not believe the stories I hear just because I say, wow, that's so interesting, that comment you said. And then 2 minutes later, I've got the whole story. And I think, wow, that person, and I'm connected. And even if I never see that person again, I've kind of come away with this connectedness. Tell me about that.
Yeah. I think this is sort of the strangers on a plane phenomenon. I think there's
strangers on the plane phenomenon.
I think there's several parts of it that are important. First, it happens, and it happens a lot more than people realize. Just about everybody seems to have a story of some stranger who told them all sorts of things that were surprised to hear, or vice versa, that found themselves venting to the person in the lobby at the hospital, or the bartender, or
bartenders get a lot of stories
absolutely.
that way. But I thought that was just the alcohol. It isn't necessarily.
It is not just the alcohol. And in fact, I would say that's the second part of this, which is for sure there are certain contexts and certain professions within the context that tend to stimulate this. It at least appears to be the case. So contexts in which you are in a semi-intimate space, interacting one-on-one with somebody who has an incentive to listen to you.
The bartender has an incentive because the bartender needs a tip.
Bingo. Bartenders, barbers, hairdressers,
you don't get your nails done the way I do, but that's
exactly the person doing your nails, the taxi driver, the Uber driver. These are contexts where you're essentially one-on-one. They're semi-private, but they're still public.
You're kind of held captive for a short period of time.
You're held captive, and the person has an incentive to be nice because you're paying them, tipping them, etc. And it can be monotonous for them. And so listening to people can be interesting. And I think there's some that I have not studied this particular issue, and I want to see a great study of this at some point.
You should do it. It's interesting.
There are some. There's a very interesting psychological study. I think it's actually called Strangers on a Train, that has shown that in train stations, if you approach people and divulge something personal about yourself, they're very likely to do the same in return. So if you go and sit on a plane and you get a text and something bad happens and you just vent it out to the next person sitting next to you, they're likely to do the same, or they're more likely to do the same, to vent something personal to you than had you not done that. But going back to the context, there's something about the context in which bartenders and so on interact with people. And again, it's not the alcohol that makes it easy. I think it's those elements, but there's another element that I think is quite important, which is anonymity. You have to worry, not just your mother, but your best friend, your spouse, the people you work with, the people you see at church, whatever.
They know other people.
Exactly.
They're in your network.
They're in your network. You have to worry about what they as individuals think about you, but also about your reputation with respect to all of the people that you both know, all the people you have in common in your friendship network. And
the barber, he doesn't know.
The barber doesn't know
my
anybody.
Sister or my mother or my brother.
You will never see that Uber driver again. You will never see that taxi driver again. You will never see that Lyft driver again. You might see the nail salon person or the barber and so on again. But even then, they're not in your network. In fact, one of the things an anthropologist, I believe her name was Linda Furman, found, she studied hair salons. And she studied a hair salon that was frequented by elderly Jewish women. And what she found is that the hair salon had been a place where people would find very intimate things about their cancer. Because the context was an intimate one, it was all women. They were elderly, so it was not uncommon for cancer to be an issue. But of course, chemo, etc., affects your hair.
Oh, of course.
And so it just became a really natural place for people to vent, not just about that, but every aspect about how it was affecting their relations, their sense of self, their sense of being a woman.
And find cognitive empathy, because there were other people there and people...
Bingo.
Wow.
And find cognitive empathy. So I think absolutely the idea of talking to strangers, both because of you're essentially free of reputational costs, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah.
And in many contexts, not all of them, you're talking to people who have an incentive to listen in a context that's somewhat private. Means that this phenomenon is actually far more common than people think it is. And again, another reason why when we say, no, we don't trust anybody, we're not actually that right about ourselves.
Yeah, wonderful, Mario. And it breaks isolation, it soothes the soul, and it kind of gives you a sense that, there are a lot of really good people out there of every color, shape, size, age, socioeconomic background, and you find common ground. And there's something in that, I think, that's soothing and that kind of makes us all well.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. I think you're one of the busiest people in the world based on your resume, and I'm not sure how you hopped from University of Chicago to Princeton to Harvard, but certainly it wasn't from sitting around. So I appreciate the time very much.
It's my pleasure. It's been my pleasure.
And and I'll be back in touch on another subject, I promise.
Thank you, Judy.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning into my Happiness podcast, where we explore how to get the best out of the empty nest. I hope you'll subscribe, write a review, and reach out to me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Check out my website, judyhollandauthor.com. Have a great day, and remember, make it happen.